Hi class. As we go through and continue our lectures with online videos, I'm going to be breaking up the lecture slides into short segments, and I will also be starting out each of the videos with a list of the learning objectives that are specifically for that video. So as you can see here, when we're looking at the aspects of adaptive immunity, the two learning outcomes that are in bold are the two that are going to be covered in this video: the distinguishing characteristics of adaptive immunity and contrasting cellular and humoral immunity, as well as active and passive and natural and artificial. So we've talked about innate immunity. We've talked about the first line of defense, which is going to include things such as the skin and the various features of the skin, as well as fluid flow, things of that nature, just to try and keep something from getting into the tissues. And then we talked about the second line of defense, which is going to try to slow down an infection. So that's where you've got things like fever, you've got inflammation, you've got the complement system, interferon, etc. Now we're getting into the third line of defense, adaptive immunity. And characteristics that are unique to adaptive immunity include that it's going to be systemic. It is going to have an action throughout the body. So rather than having an inflammatory response happening right at a particular area where for example, a cut has happened, we are going to have antibodies that are released in the bloodstream. So they're going to be going throughout the body. So this is going to have a more systemic form of attack. It's also going to be very specific. So when we talk about adaptive immunity, we're talking about T cells and B cells, and we're going to be talking about antibodies, and we're going to see how these are really going to be geared toward particular pathogens. So if you're thinking of a neutrophil is not going to change its form of attack if it's looking at one type of bacterium versus another. But when we look at these T cells and B cells, they are going to be very specific in what they are actually attacking against. And then also the adaptive part is going to deal with the fact that we have a memory aspect of this area of our immunity, where once we have been exposed to something, we are going to then keep some of the cells around that recognized that particular specific foe. And because we're keeping these memory cells around, the next time we're exposed to that same specific pathogen, we're able to recognize it quickly and launch an attack much more rapidly. So there may be no noticeable illness whatsoever, even though you have in fact been exposed to that particular pathogen. So let's talk about cellular versus humoral immunity. So when we look at cellular or cell-mediated immunity, this is going to be your T cells. So with the cellular immunity, you're going to have cells attacking cells. So this is going to be where T cells are going to attack foreign cells, or they may be destroying your own cells of your body that have, for example, become hosts to viruses and are now being used to create more viruses. So the cellular or cell-mediated, this is going to be where you are actually focusing on cells that need to be responded to. So we're talking about intracellular pathogens at this point, right? We're talking about pathogens that have gotten into cells. With humoral or antibody-mediated, you're talking about B cells. Now, B cells are going to be activated into plasma cells. So part of what we'll be talking about with this part of the chapter is that the adaptive immunity has to be activated in order to be able to really launch its attack. So when the B cells become activated, they will become a type of cell that produces antibodies, and antibodies themselves do not destroy anything. I've mentioned before that they are going to act sort of like a citizen's arrest. What they're going to try to do is stop a pathogen, kind of hold it in place or clump it together, like what we saw with our antigen-antibody reactions with blood typing. And so they're going to try and just stop it and make it visible, make it targeted to be destroyed. So Since the antibodies are going to be released in the bloodstream, of course, we're talking about extracellular stages of infection. So you can see that we are dealing with adaptive immunity. We're dealing not only with cells that have already been compromised or cells that could pose a threat, like a bacterium, but we're also trying to stop further compromised cells by trying to stop that pathogen before it can actually infect a cell. So, different categories of adaptive immunity. We've got active immunity versus passive, and then we've got natural versus artificial. So, let me just say first, active immunity, regardless of which type it is, active is going to mean that your body is stimulated. So, we're going to have that activation. It is stimulated to produce its own antibodies. To do that, you have to be exposed. So, that's where we get to the natural versus artificial. With the natural active immunity, you're actually going to be naturally exposed to the particular pathogen. That means you're going to get sick, right? You're going to actually be exposed to the particular disease-causing agent. With artificial active immunity, what's going to happen is you're going to receive a vaccination. So the point of vaccination is it is going to trigger the immune response. And the immune response is then going to be the same. If you triggered it versus with a vaccination versus if you actually triggered it just by being exposed to the real thing. So with some of my classes, I was able to kind of speak about this before spring break, and I like to often compare this to taking self-defense classes. I usually ask, who has taken a self-defense class and why did you do that? And usually the answer is, well, you want to know how to defend yourself. So knowing that you want to know how to defend yourself and then comparing this to vaccinations, then it's kind of like saying, well, if you want to know how to defend yourself, why don't you just go and put yourself in danger? Why don't you go to a bad part of town? Why don't you go and put yourself in front of someone you know to be violent? And of course, the natural answer to that is you actually want to be able to protect yourself ahead of time so that you can protect yourself from those particular threats, right? You want to learn how to defend yourself in a situation that is actually not dangerous. That's why you would go to a self-defense class, because you actually want to learn defense, but you don't actually want to be in jeopardy while you're doing it. You don't expect your self-defense instructor to actually truly attack you and potentially cause you harm. That's why we have vaccinations. Vaccinations are self-defense classes for the immune system. They are teaching the immune system how to defend itself against a particular threat without actually having to be exposed to the threat. So both of these types are going to result in activation of your immune system and production of antibodies. It's just a question of, do you actually want to get sick in the meantime, or do you maybe not? Do you maybe want to take the self-defense class instead? So when we look at the vaccines, now not all vaccines are going to be the same. Some are going to be kind of different proteins from a particular agent, a virus or a bacteria. They can be dead pathogens, or they can be attenuated, which means weakened. And now we get to where not all people can get all vaccines, because when you have a weakened pathogen, if you're a healthy person, you're going to be able to take that vaccine, no problem. But if you are a person who has an underlying situation where you are immune compromised, you should not have an attenuated vaccine, right? Or you might be guarded against it because it's weakened, but if you're weakened, it could still pose a potential threat. So that's where there's some variation in guidances about different types of vaccines. But once again, the purpose of the vaccine itself is to let the body be triggered into being prepared for a particular threat without actually having to be exposed to the full force real threat. Now, sometimes you have to get booster shots, which are periodic immunizations to stimulate the memory, because of course we live for a long time. And so we're going to learn about memory cells. We're going to learn about how this immunity that you build up, it can last for decades, but it can weaken over time. And so with particular types of vaccinations, you may have to go in and get boosters to just kind of refresh your self-defense moves, right? Okay, so that was active immunity, the different types of active. When we look at passive immunity, natural versus artificial, both of them are going to be passive because your immune system is not going to get activated. What that means is that your B cells will not be triggered to become plasma cells and to produce antibodies. So this is going to be temporary immunity where you are going to receive pre-made antibodies. Pre-made antibodies, and then that means once they're gone, because antibodies are proteins, once they're gone, they're gone. And so then your body is going to have to be exposed to start making them on their own. So that's what we mean by passive. So, of course, natural passive immunity is where you get temporary immunity from antibodies by another person. We're talking about motherhood here, right? We're talking about the antibodies that might pass through the placenta and then also in the breast milk. This is temporary protection for a fetus or for a newborn. Our immune system doesn't start really revving up until around 2 or 3 months of age. And so we have a period of time where if an individual is able to breastfeed, they're actually conferring their own immunity onto that child for a short period of time until the child is then going to be able to start kind of producing their own. But then they'll still have to either be exposed by getting sick or they'll have to be exposed through vaccinations. Now, artificial passive immunity, this is where you would get injected with antibodies from another person or from an animal. And so there's a few different reasons that you would get this or types that you would get. For example, if you're going temporarily to another country, another area, you might receive some pre-made antibodies just to protect you. But you can also see there's different examples for rabies, for tetanus, etc.